Hi everyone, this is part 3 of me reading the Twits to you. You've asked me to read that to you. One of the reasons I'm putting this online instead of reading it to you live is because lots of you are being very flexible in doing your school home learning or remote learning in the evenings, or for Duck, she's in a different time zone to us, so he wouldn't get to hear the story if I did it live. So I'm putting it online for you, and also you might want to listen to it at bedtime, or you might want to listen to it when your mum or dad are in a meeting, okay? I hope your brothers and sisters might be joining you. This chapter is on page 16. We're starting on page 16, so if you're reading along, it's the wormy spaghetti chapter, page 16. If by any chance you haven't heard the other ones, there's 2 videos before this that you should go and watch. The wormy spaghetti. The next day, to pay Mr. Twit back for the frog trick, Mrs. Twit sneaked into the garden and dug up some worms. This is not going to be good for Mr. Twit. She chose big long ones and put them in a tin and carried the tin back to the house under her apron. At 1 o'clock, she cooked spaghetti for lunch and she mixed the worms in with the spaghetti, but only on her husband's plate, not hers. The worms didn't show because everything was covered with tomato sauce and sprinkled with cheese. "Hey, my spaghetti's moving," cried Mr. Twit, poking around with his fork. "Ah, it's a new kind," said Mrs. Twit, taking a mouthful from her own plate, which of course had no worms. "It's called squiggly spaghetti. It's delicious. Eat it up while it's nice and hot." Mr. Twit started eating, twisting the long tomato-covered strings around his fork and shoveling them into his mouth. Soon there was tomato sauce all over his hairy chin. "It's not as good as the ordinary kind," he said, talking with his mouth full, of course. "It's too squishy." "I find it very tasty," said Mrs. Twit. She was watching him from the other end of the table. It gave her great pleasure to watch him eating worms. "I find it rather bitter," said Mr. Twit. "It's got a distinctly bitter flavour. Buy the other kind next time." Mrs. Twit waited until Mr. Twit had eaten the whole plateful. Then she said, "You want to know why your spaghetti was squishy?" Mr. Twit wiped the tomato sauce from his beard with the corner of the tablecloth. "Why?" "And why it was a nasty bitter taste?" "Why?" "Because it was worms," cried Mr. Twit, clapping her hands, stamping her feet on the floor, and rocking with a horrible laughter. She is the worst wife in the world. Imagine if your mum did that to your dad. The next chapter, chapter 19, or page 19, is called The Funny Walking Stick. To pay Mrs. Twit back for the worms in his spaghetti, Mr. Twit thought up a really clever, nasty trick. One night when the old woman was asleep, he crept out of bed and took her walking stick downstairs to his work shed. There he stuck a tiny round piece of wood, no thicker than a 1-cent coin, we don't have those in Singapore, maybe a 5-cent coin, onto the bottom of the stick. This made the stick a bit longer, but the difference was so small that the next morning Mrs. Twit didn't notice at all. The following night, Mr. Twit stuck another tiny bit of wood on the end of her walking stick. Every night he crept downstairs and he added a tiny thickness of wood to the end of the walking stick. He did it very neatly so that the extra bits looked like part of the old stick. Gradually, oh, but so gradually, Mrs. Twit's walking stick was getting longer and longer. Have you spotted the problem yet? Now, when something is growing very slowly, it's impossible to notice it happening. You yourself, for example, are actually growing taller every day. But you wouldn't think it, would you? It's happening so slowly you can't even notice it from one week to the next. It was the same with Mrs. Twit's walking stick. It was all so slow and gradual that she didn't notice how long it was getting, even when it was halfway up her shoulder. "That stick's too long for you," Mr. Twit said to her one day. "Why, so it is," said Mrs. Twit, looking at the stick. "I had a feeling there was something wrong, but I couldn't for the life of me think of what it was." "There's something wrong, all right," said Mr. Twit, beginning to enjoy himself. "What can have happened?" said Mrs. Twit, staring at her old walking stick. "It must suddenly have grown longer." "Don't be a fool," said Mr. Twit. "How can a walking stick possibly grow longer? It's made of dead wood, isn't it? Dead wood can't grow." "Then what on earth has happened?" cried Mrs. Twit. "It's not the stick, it's you," said Mr. Twit, grinning horribly. "It's you that's getting shorter. I've been noticing it for some time now." "Not true," said Mrs. Twit. "You're shrinking, woman," said Mr. Twit. "Not possible." "Oh, it's not possible." Got the wrong character then, didn't I, for a minute? "Oh, yes, it jolly well is," said Mr. Twit. "You're shrinking fast. You're shrinking dangerously fast. Why, you must have shrunk at least 1 foot or 30 centimetres in the last few days." "Never!" cried Mrs. Twit. "Of course you have. Take a look at your stick. See how much you've shrunk in comparison. You have got the shrinks. That's what you've got. You've got the dreaded shrinks." Mrs. Twit began to feel so trembly she had to sit down. Page 23, the next chapter, Mrs. Twit has the shrinks. By the way, that's not a real word, having the shrinks, or a real phrase. But when you shrink, you get smaller. Something shrinks, it gets smaller. As soon as Mrs. Twit sat down, Mr. Twit pointed at her and shouted, "There you are! You're sitting in your old chair and you've shrunk so much your feet aren't even touching the ground." Mrs. Twit looked down at her feet, and by golly, the man was right. Her feet were not touching the ground. Oh no, what's he done? Because she hasn't really shrunk. What's he done? Mrs. Twit looked down at her feet. By golly, the man was right. Her feet were not touching the ground. Mr. Twit, you see, had been as clever with the chair as he had with the walking stick. Every night when he had gone downstairs and stuck a little bit extra on the stick, he'd done the same to the 4 legs of Mrs. Twit's chair. "Just you, look at you sitting there in your same old chair. You've shrunk so much your feet are dangling in the air." Mrs. Twit went white with fear. When you go white with fear, it means the blood drains from your face and your skin just goes white or grey. You're so scared. "You have got the shrinks," cried Mr. Twit, pointing his finger at her like a pistol. "You have got them badly. You have got the most terrible case of shrinks I've ever seen." Mrs. Twit became so frightened she began to dribble. But Mr. Twit, still remembering the worms in his spaghetti, didn't feel sorry for her at all. "I suppose you know what happens to you when you get the shrinks," he said. "What?" gasped Mrs. Twit. "What happens?" "Your head shrinks into your neck. Your neck shrinks into your body shrinks into your legs, and your legs shrink into your feet. And in the end, there's nothing left of you except a pair of shoes and a bundle of old clothes." He's ridiculous. "I can't bear it," said Mrs. Twit. "It's a terrible disease," said Mr. Twit. "The worst in the world." "How long have I got?" cried Mrs. Twit. "How long before I finish up as a bundle of old clothes and a pair of shoes?" Mr. Twit put on a very solemn face. "Well, at the rate you're going," he said, shaking his head sadly, "I'd say 10, 11 days. "Hey, but there isn't anything we can do," cried Mrs. Twit. Well, there's one cure for the shrinks, cried Mr. Twit. Tell me quickly. We'll have to hurry, said Mr. Twit. I'm ready. I'll do anything you say, begged Mrs. Twit. You won't last long if you don't, said Mr. Twit, giving her another grisly grin. What is it I must do? Cried Mrs. Twit, clutching her cheeks. You've got to be stretched. Mr. Twit, he's a meanie. Just remember, though, that Mrs. Twit's nasty too. Mrs. Twit gets stretching. So I'm up to page 26. So I'll stop now and I'll read page 26 onwards in part 4 of my videos. Sleep well.